Good evening, the interwebs. What a cold day today was. Ugh. I oh my friend, she lives. Is it in Columbus, Ohio? I haven't seen her in a long time. But of course, with the good old Facebook, you can reconnect with people, and yeah, I think it's Columbus. It might be Cleveland. And she took a picture of her house today, her driveway, and it was snowing. So much for being 3 weeks into spring. Yeah. Anywho, tonight we move on in the jungle. And it's interesting, besides the funny aspect of me butchering all these poor Lithuanian names. There's it's a book that I haven't read in a long time, and it's really cool kind of coming back to it. And man, it just does an incredible job of really showing us what's going on, all those awesome things that are happening at this time in our nation's history. And I don't know how many of you thought about, boy, I wish my childhood could have had tomato cans for me to play with, and big puddles of green, who knows what, in the middle of the street. But anyway, let's get started. Jump into it. So, in his capacity as delicatessen vendor, Jacobus had many acquaintances. Among these was one of the special policemen employed by Durham, whose duty as frequently was to pick out men for employment. Jacobus, had never tried it, but he expressed a certainty that he could get some of his friends a job through this man. It was agreed after consultation that he should make an effort with old Antinas and with Jonas. Jorgis was confident of his ability to get himself work, unassisted by anyone. As we have said before, he was not mistaken in this. He had gone to Brown's and stood there not more than a half of an hour before one of the bosses noticed his form towering above the rest, and signaled him. Which followed, or what followed, was brief and to the point. Speak English? No, Lithuanian. Jorgis had studied this word carefully. Job? Ja. And he nodded. Work here before? No understand. Signals and gestures on the part of the boss, vigorous shakes of the head by Jorgis. Shovel guts? No understand. More shakes of the head. Zarnos bagzitadzits zaglofa. Ja? See door? Pointing. Ja? Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Understand? Reuters. Septieni. DQ. Tamistai. Thank you, sir. That was all. Jorgis turned away, and then, in the sudden rush of full realization of his triumph swept over him, he gave a yell and a jump, and he started off to run. He had a job. And he went all the way home as if on wings, and to burst into the house like a cyclone, to rage with the numerous lodgers who had just turned in for their daily sleep. Meantime, Jacobus had been to see his friend, the policeman, and received encouragement. So it was a happy party. There being no more to be done that day, the shop was left under the care of Lucia, and her husband sallied forth to show his friends the sights of Packingtown. Jacobus did this with all the air of a country gentleman escorting a party of visitors over his estate. He was an old-time resident, and all these wonders had grown up under his eyes, and he had a personal pride in them. The packers might own the land, but he claimed the landscape, and there was no one to say nay to this. They passed down the busy street that led to the yards. It was still early morning, and everything was at high tide of activity. A steady stream of employees was pouring through the gate. Employees of the higher sort at this hour, clerks and stenographers and such. For women there were waiting. Stop, my cat's yelling at me. Stop yelling at me. A steady stream of employees was pouring through the gate. Employees of the higher sort at this hour, clerks and stenographers and such. For the women there were waiting big 2-horse wagons, which set off at a gallop as fast as they were filled. In the distance, there was heard again the lowing of the cattle, a sound as if a far off ocean calling. They followed it, this time as eager children in the sight of a circus menagerie, which indeed the scene a good deal resembled. They crossed the railroad tracks, and then on each side of the street were the pens full of cattle. They would have stopped to look, but Jacobus hurried them on to where there was a stairway and a raised gallery, from which everything could be seen. Here they stood, staring breathless with wonder. There is over a square mile of space in the yards, and more than half of it is occupied by cattle pens. North and south, as far as the eye can see and reach, there stretches a sea of pens. And they were all filled. So many cattle no one had ever dreamed existed in the world. Red cattle, black, white, yellow cattle, old cattle, young cattle. Great bellowing bulls and little calves, not an hour born. Meek-eyed milch cows and fierce longhorn Texas steers. The sound of them here was of all the barnyards in the universe. And as for counting them, it would have taken all day simply to count the pens. Here and there ran long alleyways, blocked at intervals by gates, and Jacobus told them that the number of these gates was around 25,000. Jacobus had recently been reading a newspaper article which was full of statistics such as that. He was very proud as he repeated them and made his gestures cry out with wonder. Jorgis, too, had a little of this sense of pride. He had not just gotten a job and become a sharer in all this activity, a cog in this marvelous machine. Here and there about the alleys galloped men upon horseback, booted and carrying long whips. They were very busy, calling out to each other and to those who were driving the cattle. There were drovers and stock raisers who had come from far states, and brokers and commission merchants and buyers for all the big packing houses. Here and there they would stop to inspect a bunch of cattle, and there they would parley, brief and businesslike. A buyer would nod or drop his whip, and that would mean a bargain, and he would note it in a little book, along with hundreds of others he had made that morning. Oh, excuse me. Then Jacobus pointed out the place where the cattle were being driven to and weighed upon a great scale that would weigh 100,000 pounds at once and record it automatically. It was near the east entrance that they stood, and all along this east side of the yards ran railroad tracks, into which the cars were run, loaded with cattle. All night long this had been going on. Now the pens were full. By tonight they would all be empty, and the same would be done again. And what will become of all these creatures? Cried Tedda. By tonight, Jacobus answered, they will all be killed and cut up. And over there, on the other side of the packing houses, are more railroad tracks, where the cars come and take them away. There were 250 miles of track within the yards. Their guide went on to tell them. They brought about 10,000 head of cattle in every day, and as many hogs, and half as many sheep, which meant some 8 to 10 million live creatures turned into food every year. One stood and watched, and little by little caught the drift of the tide, as if it set the direction of the pack, as it was set in the direction of the packing houses. There were groups of cattle being driven into chutes, which which were roadways about 15 feet wide, raised high above the pens. In these chutes, the streams of animals were continuous. It was quite uncanny to watch them, pressing on to their fate, all unsuspicious of a very river of death. Our friends were not poetical, and the sight suggested to them no metaphors of human destiny. They thought only a wonderful efficiency of it all. The chutes in which the hogs went climbed high up and on the very top of the distant buildings, and Jacobus explained that the hogs went up by the power of their own legs. And then their weight carried them back down through all the processes necessary to make them into pork. They don't waste anything here, said the guide. And then he laughed and he added his witticism, which he was pleased that his unsophisticated friend should take to be his own. They use everything about the hog except the squeal. In front of Brown's general office building, there grows a tiny plot of grass. And this, you will learn, is the only bit of green thing in Packingtown. Likewise, this jest about the hog and his squeal, the stock in the trade of all the guides, is the one gleam of humor that you will find here. After they had seen enough of the pens, the party went up the street to the massive buildings which occupy the center of the yards. These buildings, made of brick and stained with innumerable layers of Packingtown smoke, were painted all over with advertising signs, from which the visitor realized suddenly that he had come to the home of many of the torments of his life. It was here that they made these products with the wonders of which they pestered him. So, by placards that defaced the landscape when he traveled, and by staring advertisements in newspapers and magazines, by silly little jingles that he could not get out of his mind, and gaudy pictures that lurked for him around every street corner. Here was where they made Brown's imperial hams and bacon, Brown's dressed beef, Brown's Excelsior sausages. Here was the headquarters of Durham's pure leaf lard, blah, and Durham's breakfast bacon, Durham's canned beef, potted ham, deviled chicken, peerless fertilizer. Entering one of Durham's buildings, they found a number of other visitors waiting, and before long there came a guide to escort them through the place. They made a great feature of showing strangers through the packing plants, for it is a good advertisement. But Jacobus whispered, maliciously that the visitors did not see any more of the packers, wanted to see them. They climbed a long series of stairways outside the building to the top of at least 5 or 6 stories. Here was the chute, with its river of hogs, all patiently toiling upward. There was a place for them to rest it to cool off. Then, through another passageway, they went into a room from which there was no returning for hogs. It was a long, narrow room, with a gallery along for visitors. At the head, there was a great iron wheel, about 20 feet in circumference, with rings here and there along its edge. Upon both sides of the wheel, there was a narrow space, into which came the hogs at the end of their journey. In the midst of them stood a great burly Negro, bare-armed and bare-chested. He was resting for the moment, for the wheel had stopped while the men were cleaning it up. In a minute or two, however, it began slowly to revolve, and then the men upon each side of it sprang to work. They had chains which they fastened about the leg of the nearest hog, and on the other end of the chain they hooked into one of the rings upon the wheel. So, as the wheel turned, a hog suddenly jerked off his feet and borne aloft. At the same instant, the car was assailed by a most terrifying shriek. The visitors stared in alarm. The woman turned pale and shrank back. The shriek was followed by another, louder, and yet another, agonizing. For once it started upon the journey, the hog never came back. At the top of the wheel, he was shunted off upon a trolley and went sailing down the room. And meantime, another was swung up, and then another, until there was a double line of them, each dangling by a foot and kicking in frenzy and squealing. The uproar was appalling, perilous to the eardrums. One feared there was too much sound for the room to hold, that the walls must give away or the ceiling cracked. There were high squeals, there were low squeals, grunts, wails of agony. There would come a momentary lull, and then fresh outburst, louder than ever, surging up to a deafening climax. It was too much for some of the visitors. The men would look at each other, laughing nervously, and the women would stand with their hands clenched, and the blood rushing into their faces, and the tears staring them in the eyes. Meanwhile, heedless of all these things, the men upon the floor were going about their work. Neither squeals of the hogs nor tears of visitors made any difference to them. One by one they hooked the hogs, and one by one, with a swift stroke, they slit their throats. There was a long line of hogs, with squeals and lifeblood ebbing away altogether, until the last each started again and vanished with a splash into a huge vat of boiling water. It was all so very businesslike that one watched it fascinated. It was pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics. Yet somehow the most matter of fact person could not help thinking of the hogs. They were so innocent, they came so very trustingly, and they were so very human in their protests, so perfectly within their rights. They had done nothing to deserve it, and it was adding insult to injury, as the thing was done here, swinging them up in this cold blooded, impersonal way, without a pretense of apology, without the homage of a tear. Now and then a visitor wept, to be sure, but this slaughtering machine ran on, visitors or no visitors. It was like some horrible crime committed in a dungeon, all unseen and unheeded, buried out of sight and out of memory. One could not stand and watch very long without becoming philosophical, without beginning to deal in symbols and smiles, and to hear a hog squeal of the universe. Was it permitted to believe that there was nowhere upon the earth or above the earth or heaven for hogs, where they were requited for all this suffering? Each one of these hogs was a separate creature. Some were white hogs, some were black, some were brown, some were spotted, some were old, some were young. Some were long and lean, some were monstrous. Each of them had an individuality of his own, a will of his own, a hope of a heart's desire. Each was full of self confidence, self importance, and a sense of dignity, and trusting and strong in faith, he had gone about his business. The while a black shadow hung over him, and a horrid fate waited in his pathway. Now, suddenly, it swooped down upon him, and had seized him by the leg, relentless, remorseless. It was. All his protests, his screams, were nothing to it. It did its cruel will with him, as if his wishes, his feelings, had simply no existence at all. It cut his throat, and it watched him gasp out his life. And now was one to believe that there was nowhere a god of hogs, to whom this hog personality was precious, to whom these hog squeals and agonies had a meaning? Who would take this hog into his arms and comfort him, reward him for his work well done, and show him the meaning of the sacrifice? Perhaps some glimpse of all this was in the thoughts of our humble minded Yorgis, as he turned to go on with the rest of the party and muttered, Diev, but I'm glad I'm not a hog. The carcass hog was scooped out of the vat by machinery. Then it fell to the second floor, passing on the way through a wonderful machine with numerous scrapers, which adjusted themselves to the size and shape of the animal. It set out it set out at the other end with nearly all of the bristles removed, and then again, strung up by machinery, it sent upon another trolley ride, this time passing between two lines of men who sat upon raised platforms, each doing a certain single thing to the carcass as it came to him. One scraped out the left leg, another scraped out the inside of the leg. One with a swift stroke cut the throat, another with two swift throats severed the head, which fell to the floor and vanished through a hole. Another made a slit down the body, a second opened the body wider. A third with a saw cut off the breastbone, a fourth loosened the entrails, a fifth pulled them out, and they all slid into a hole in the floor. There were men to scrape each side and men to scrape the back. Then there were men to clean the carcass inside, to trim it and wash it. Looking down this room, one saw, creeping slowly, a line of dangling hogs 100 yards in length. For every yard there was a man, working as if a demon were after him. At the end of this hog's progress, every inch of the carcass had been gone over several times, and then it was rolled into a chilling room, where it stayed for 24 hours, where a stranger might lose himself in a forest of freezing hogs. Before the carcass was admitted here, however, it had to pass a government inspector, who sat in the doorway and felt the glands in the neck for tuberculosis. This government inspector did not have the manner of a man who was worked to death. He was apparently not haunted by a fear that this hog might get him before he had finished his testing. If you were a sociable person, he was quite willing to enter into conversation with you and explain to you the deadly nature of the diseases which were found in tubercular pork. And while he was talking with you, you could hardly be so ungrateful as to notice that a dozen carcasses were passing him untouched. This inspector wore a blue uniform with brass buttons. He gave an atmosphere of authority to the scene and, as it were, put the stamp of the official approval upon the things which were done in Durham's. So I guess this government inspector is not so much inspecting as much as he is socializing. Jorgis went down the line with the rest of the visitors, staring open mouthed. Lost in wonder, he had dressed hogs himself in the forest of Lithuania, but he had never expected to live to see one hog dressed by several hundred men. It was like a wonderful poem to him, and he took it all guilelessly, even to the conspicuous signs demanding immaculate cleanliness of the employees. Jorgis was vexed when the cynical Jacobus translated these signs with sarcastic comments, offering to take them to the secret rooms where the spoiled meats went to be doctored. The party descended to the next floor where the various waste materials were treated. Here came the entrails to be scraped and washed clean for sausage casings. Men and women worked in here in the midst of a sickening stench, which caused the visitors to hasten by, gasping. To another room came all the scraps to be tanked, which meant boiling and pumping off the grease to make soap and lard. Below, they took out the refuse, and this too was a region in which the visitors did not linger. In still other places, men were engaged in cutting up the carcasses that had been through the chilling rooms. First, there were the splitters, the most expert workmen in the plant, who earned as much as 50 cents an hour and did not a thing all day except chop hogs down the middle. Then there were the cleaver men, great giants with muscles of iron. Each had 2 men to attend him, to slide the half carcass in front of him on the table and hold it while he chopped it. Then turn each piece so it might be chopped once more. His cleaver had a blade about 2 feet long, and he never made but one cut. He made it so neat, running holes there slipped into the floor below, to one room hams, to another room forequarters, to another sides of pork. One might go down this floor to see the pickling rooms, where the hams were put into vats, and great smoke rooms, with their all airtight iron doors. In other rooms, they prepared salt pork. There were whole cellars full of it, built up in great towers to the ceilings. In yet other rooms, there were putting up meats in boxes and barrels, and wrapping hams and bacon in oiled paper, sealing and labeling and sewing them. From the doors of these rooms went men with loaded trucks to the platform where freight cars were waiting to be filled. And one went out there and realized with a start that he had come to the last of the ground floor of this enormous building. Then the party went across the street to where they did the killing of the beef, where every hour they turned 400 or 500 cattle into meat. Unlike this place they had left, all this work was done on one floor. And instead of there being one line of carcasses which moved to the workmen, there were 15 or 20 lines, and the men moved from one to another of these. This made a scene of intense activity, a picture of human power wonderful to watch. It was all in one great room, like a circus amphitheater, with a galley for visitors running over the center. Along one side of the room ran a narrow gallery, a few feet from the floor, into which gallery the cattle were driven by men with goads, which gave them electric shocks. Once crowded in here, the creatures were prisoned, each in a separate pen, by gates that shut, leaving them no room to turn around. And when they stood bellowing and plunging over the top of the pen, they leaned one of the knockers, armed with a sledgehammer, and watching for a chance to deal a blow. The room echoed with the thuds in quick succession, the stamping and kicking of the steers. The instant the animal had fallen, the knocker passed on to another, while a second man raised a lever, and on the side of the pen was raised, and the animal, still kicking and struggling, slid out to the killing bed. Here a man put on shackles on one leg and pressed another lever, and the body was jerked up into the air. There were 15 or 20 such pens, and it was a matter of only a couple of minutes to knock 15 or 20 cattle and roll them out. Then once more the gates were opened, and another lot rushed in. And so out of each pen there rolled a steady stream of carcasses, with the men upon the killing beds had to get to and get out of the way. The manner in which they did this was something to be seen and never forgotten. They worked with furious intensity, literally upon the run, at a place with which there is nothing to be compared except maybe a football game. It was all highly specialized labor, each man having his task to do. Generally, they would consist of only 2 or 3 specific cuts, and he would pass down the line of 15 or 20 carcasses, making these cuts upon each. First there came the butcher to bleed them. This meant only one swift stroke, so swift that you could not see it, only the flash of a knife. And before you would realize it, the men had darted on to the next line. A stream of bright red was pouring out upon the floor. This floor was half an inch deep,